Welcome back, everyone. The Codex of Ibn Masud is said to contain some interesting variants. Let's start with Surah 589, which describes what needs to be done when an oath is not fulfilled. Whoever does not find the means to do that, referring to feeding poor persons, the penalty is a fast for 3 days. According to Ibn Masud's reading, it was a fast for 3 consecutive days. Incidentally, this reading is also attested to in Ubay's Codex. Upon hearing him say that the fast was not continuous, Mujahid struck Hamid in the chest and appealed to Ubay's reading of the verse. What's interesting is that some of these variants were not only significant enough to cause someone to be punched in the chest, but they were also significant enough in some cases to shape Islamic law. Ramon Harvey notes, in a commentary on a report from al-Nakha'i pertaining to the expiation of oaths within his Kitab al-Athar, al-Shaybani argues for the impermissibility of separating the 3 days of fasting by adducing the Masudian variant for Surah 589, saying, because it is in the reading of Ibn Masud, while in his Al-Asl he states, it has reached us that it is in the reading of Ibn Masud. For another example, let's look at Surah 538. As for the male thief and the female thief, cut off their hands, or in Ibn Masud's reading, cut off their right hands. Think about how important this variant is, because the standard reading could permit cutting off both hands for repeated theft. Reliance of the Traveler states, if a person steals a third time, then his left hand is amputated. Ibn Masud's reading specifies cutting off the right hand. A repeat offender could lose both hands, or only one hand, depending on the reading. Any habitual thieves out there? You better hope that you're judged by Ibn Masud's reading. You might keep one of your hands. It's interesting to look at some Muslim legal scholars and see how they handled the Quranic variants that impacted the formation of Islamic law. When Ibn Masud differed from Uthman's standardized reading, which one takes priority? As one might imagine, different scholars held different opinions, as Ramon Harvey's recent study shows. In the milieu of al-Nakha'i, the Quranic readings of Ibn Masud are not variants, but an alternative canon. He therefore uses readings such as Surah 538 and 589 as the very basis for the articulation of law, God's commands. Harvey notes that by the end of the 8th century, this position was no longer defensible for the scholars he surveyed. During the 10th century, Al-Jassas gives us another perspective, as he, referring to Al-Jassas, cannot defend them, that is, Ibn Masud's variants on Surah 538 and 89, as mutawatir narrations which would make them part of the canonical Quran. He argues they are embodied in widespread practice that can establish rulings without an equivalent level of transmission for their recitation. This correlates with juristic discussions on ijma, or consensus, in which the certainty of a particular position was engendered by the existence of an initially mutawatir tradition that was later not preserved. So you can see the difficulty. Ibn Masud's readings could not be ignored, but they were also not mass transmitted, or if they were thought to be initially, that didn't continue into later centuries. So, do you ignore Ibn Masud's readings, or treat them as an alternative canon, or something in the middle? Al-Jassas argued that a legal ruling could still be established on Ibn Masud's reading, since it was widespread and famous, making it permissible as an addition to the Quran. This is in contrast to Ubay's reading of Surah 2:185, which was not as widely transmitted. Let's move to the 11th century, where al-Sarakhsi takes a different approach. Finally, al-Sarakhsi develops a new approach to the questions of revelation, abrogation, and transmission raised by the readings of Ibn Masud through utilizing a wider epistemological shift in the Hanafi madhab. Drawing partly on the ideas of earlier figures in the school, he argues that certainty is too stringent a requirement for legal addition to the Quran. Rather, knowledge that inspires confidence is sufficient. This means that Ibn Masud's readings in Kufa can be reclaimed as single narrations that became mass transmitted from the generation of his students onwards. In al-Sarakhsi's terminology, such verses are functionally identical with the Mashur report, initially singly transmitted but later widely accepted, and are able to play a full role in the legal sphere without threatening the integrity of the Quranic canon. Was Ibn Masud's reading abrogated? How reliably and widely was it transmitted? Did its transmission qualify it for use in legal rulings? If so, how does one reconcile the differences between his reading and others when forming Islamic law? These are the sorts of questions that Muslim scholars had to answer, and it's interesting to compare and contrast their methodology. There are many other differences in Ibn Masud's reading. Let's sample a few more before we finish. We can get surahs 113 and 114 out of the way very quickly, since Ibn Masud didn't believe they were part of the Quran. In Surah 33:6, the prophet of the Quran is conspicuously called the father of the believers, something absent in the standardized reading. Surah 567 reflects a Shia reading, mentioning Ali by name. Surah 33:25 does the same thing. Mentioning a companion by name is obviously unexpected in the Quran. Surah 51:58 apparently changes who is speaking. According to Uthman's standardized reading, the narrator says Allah is the provider. According to Ibn Masud, Allah is clearly speaking. Ibn Masud's reading actually follows Surah 51, 56 through 57 much more naturally than the standard reading. Surah 24:27 appears superior in Ibn Masud's reading as well, since one logically greets the inhabitants of a house first before entering. This verse is one of several where the need for a correction has been suggested, even by Muslim commentators, as noted by Devin Stewart. He says this emendation is attributed to Ibn Abi Hatim, who is supposed to have remarked, "In my opinion, this is an instance where the copyists erred." Ibn Masud's variant readings are interesting for a couple of reasons. The first reason is simply their content, what they actually say compared to the standardized reading. The second reason is that Ibn Masud's Codex invites us to look back into early Muslim history, and in this history we see fluid texts, readings that agree and disagree, and some critical analysis of these issues by Muslim scholars. It's actually a very refreshing change from the miraculous preservation of the Quran lie that has spread like cancer through the Muslim world. So Muslims, which do you prefer, the miraculous preservation myth, or are you prepared to engage intellectually with the history of your Quran? Let me know in the comments section. A big thanks to Blackjack for contributing to this video. Make sure you check out his blog, The Islam Issue. It's in the description box. I'll see you next time.